first started getting really interested in forests half a dozen years ago, you would never hear the word landscapes in conferences. Now you hear it all the time. And actually, you've been a big part in making that change. I think that the landscapes discipline concept model has helped us see through lots of the sort of stovepiping that previously existed between the Agriculture Ministry and the Forest Department and so forth. We are seeing the work landscape together more. But that's rather at a conceptual level. At a policy level, those departments do still function rather independently. How does the landscapes concept move to implementation? How does it help us look after forests and agriculture, just for example, in tandem?
Well, that's an easy question, isn't it?
Let's see. I had to ask it.
First of all, it's about the fragmentation that you describe. We need to deal with that fragmentation. Now, one question becomes, do we have to deal with it by formalizing a defragmented setup of institutions? I'm not so sure. I think we still need the expertise and the specialization and the efficiencies that are brought by specialized institutions and sectors. That's all fine. But overlaying that, I think we need the methods, the local solutions, the accountabilities to combine them. And that's something that's missing today. Or maybe it's not really missing, but we are not valuing enough that those solutions need to happen locally, are happening locally, and we're not really bringing about the benefits of the combined holistic solutions. I'm not against sector delineations. I'm just against the inability to combine those sectors.
No, I'm not for or either of them. I don't suppose anybody in this room is. But with respect, that still sounded like rather a high-altitude conceptual answer to my question. When a donor gives a large sum of money to a developing country, it normally gives it for forest projects or for agroforestry projects. How do you change not only the mindset, but also the policy implementation framework?
I'm not going to solve that in 20 seconds here, but those investments are, of course, fine if they take the bigger picture into account. If you take investments to reduce forest change, which is popular, that's fine, but they need to take into account the implications on food security, on poverty, on equity, and all the rest of it that comes along with the landscape opportunities. So everybody in all investments need that holistic perspective.
But with respect, and I will finish this now, we must all agree with you because what you're saying makes eminent sense. But is that actually happening? Is that a prescription for an ideal world, or do you think that academia's new conceptual way of thinking about agro and forestry is actually changing the way that policymakers conceive and implement policy?
Well, it's easy to say yes then. No, I think we are. I mean, this is evidence that we are thinking along new pathways and that we are ready to take on the complexities of combined solutions. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. Emmanuel, I have a question for you, but did you want to comment on that?
I'd love to, please, yes. Because to complement what Peter's just said, I think that one thing that is really changing the landscape now on these issues is carbon finance. Because carbon finance is creating a mechanism where local actors can have a very concrete incentive to sequestrate carbon through agroforestry, replantations, change in the agricultural practices and everything, which creates economic value, financial value, social value, environmental value. And that is changing, I think it will change the whole landscape of official development assistance from sovereign relationship, bilateral or multilateral relationship, into hopefully more and more aggregations of change makers at the local level. What we need, and the projects I think that will work and will be carbon positive, will be projects which will be led by the communities themselves, social entrepreneurs, self-help groups, which can be financed by mechanisms such as carbon credits. And so this is just to give an example. We are using this example in many ways. I know some of us are doing that in others, which is very powerful to empower local people with money that did not exist, because we are valuing the positive externality of sequestrating carbon.
Okay, thank you for that. While we have you, let me follow up with a question that I wanted to ask. So you've made a very strong and laudable commitment to watch the emissions, do mitigation across not only your company efforts but your supply chain. Can you just tell me a little bit about the policy context in which you're making that commitment? Because of course I immediately start thinking about the cost to you and whether you can remain competitive in the absence of regulation that forces you to take those steps. So are you making that commitment in expectation of regulation, or can you do it without regulation? And if so, how on earth can you remain competitive in that scenario?
Well, I think in many ways we are facing, as an industry, more or less the end of the model that I was describing. I think the model of very sophisticated supply chains, low transparency overall because it's so complex and you can't trace at the end of the day. There is a growing request from consumers to understand better what they ultimately are using as food, which is growing, and that's a fact, with or without regulation. I think there is also a very clear reality of scarcity of resources. You start to have scarcity of water. Scarcity of water means scarcity of food in many ways, whether it is transformed or whether it is homemade. You can see the volatility of raw material prices, which is huge and has been incredible since now 5 or 6 years. And so I think this big model that has supplied a very large number of calories has probably ended in many ways hunger in many places, but far from everywhere. I think this model needs to be reinvented, with or without the constraint or the incentives, because carbon is an incentive, carbon finance is an incentive of that. So when we do this, I think we are simply investing. Yes, it's a cost, but it's an investment for the future, because if we do that, if our farmers have more capabilities, they have a better soil, they are feeding their cows with ultimately plants that have also transmitting a better quality in the milk. We're able to pay that milk at a higher price. They're getting better productivity. In the same time, they are sinking carbon in the soil. So it's a win-win situation, and we are having a more resilient ecosystem. And resilience, at the end of the day, in such volatile environment, I think is one of the things that business as a whole needs to work on. So it's actually an investment in the future. If there is the incentive or regulation on top of this, I would more than welcome this.
Yes, and that, well, you would welcome it. It would make you more competitive because your competitors would have to shoulder the same burden. Yeah, okay. But in conclusion, I think you were saying that a more frugal company that uses resources more efficiently is liable to be more successful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the truth is that there is a cost, but it's also an investment in the future. I think that whether this is in lower cost, when we recycle PET, for instance, PET at the cost of oil today is a very attractive plastic that is very secure for the bottles, for instance. But when the cost of oil will be maybe sometime at $150 or $200, it will be too late. So if we today invest in the recycling activities, as we do in many, or in a number, not many yet, but a number already of large capital cities in Brazil, Mexico, Jakarta, Argentina, etc., we are structuring the recycling activity. We're actually creating a safer work environment for the scavengers in the landfills, developing social security for them and developing better working conditions. And in the same time, we're making sure that the very scarce food-grade plastic, other than going into energy because it is burnt as a landfill, or turns into Chinese textiles at the end of the day, which is much lower grade. We keep it in the high grade plastic, of food grade plastic, and this is a resource for us. So it's a very expensive resource that at the end of the day, we won't have to pay, and as a we won't deplete the resources of the planet. So yes, there is a correlation between healthier overall eating and drinking habits and behaviors, better efficiency and realistic food and water industry, and hopefully the planet and the overall food and water cycles.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Baroness, you said we've got to get beyond philanthropy, and I guess that also means ODA. That's for sure. We all agree with that. But I guess your implication is that we haven't yet got far beyond philanthropy and ODA. Perhaps you could just expound on that a little bit for us. What do you see when you look around for solid, investable products that will push sustainability and perhaps make a little bit of money too? What do we need to do to produce more of those projects at scale?
I think one of the problems still today is to find one solid project. Obviously, as a financier, you want to have a return. So it's how will you measure the return? And obviously, thank God we have evolved from just financial return. So it's also measuring, and I know with Emmanuel, we've been debating, how do you measure social return? How do you measure environmental return? Which are measures that are extremely complex and complicated to find. And then, of course, you have a big issue with time, because these projects, and I have the same time horizon as Emmanuel, you have to invest. You really must invest for the next 10, 15, if not 20 years. And especially global landscape is a 20-year horizon. So getting investors committed on a 20-year horizon is quite complicated. And then again, you know, finding projects where you feel comfortable for the next 20 years are scarce. And I guess it's part of our role is trying to structure.
I guess in the life of a forest, 20 years is not such a long time.
So that's one of the big challenges, and that's why typically what you were debating earlier, we moved from a single, for example, from just forestry to agroforestry, which financially makes sense because you can combine a short-term return, especially locally, and a longer-term return with forestry. I think the financial world still is getting used to these types of projects.
The difficulty is identifying projects that are solid, investable, but also in stirring up enough appetite in investors to be in keep their money in those projects for the long term. In that context, how does the landscape's approach, the need for coordination across governments help, do you think?
So I think one of the key elements is stability, because especially when you're investing abroad, for a lot of investors, they want stability, they want continuity. Those are key elements. And then, of course, I think PPPs are very attractive because, one, it's securing different sources of investments. I work on it a lot because I think they are a source of, again, stability, and investors always look to de-risk. It's not just returns, especially when you're telling them that they won't see the color of the return before 10 years. You have to find a better balance into what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Dr. Ngozi, you spoke mostly about landscape restoration, as well as where some of the resources for that endeavor need to come from rich donor countries or companies in rich countries, as well as mobilizing local resources. One thought that occurred to me is that restoration is not only what we need to do, we also need to conserve standing carbon-rich old-growth forest, of which Nigeria, just for example, has some in abundance. Can you just speak to that sort of tension, if it is a tension within government, because of course you're in the privileged position of having seen the world from the development community and from the decision-making community.
Well, let me just say one thing. I really don't subscribe so much to the fact that either the money for the restoration or for maintaining what we have will ultimately come from rich donor countries. We may want it to, but it won't. And I think it diverts attention from what we need to do. Should it come from rich donor countries? Yes. But will it? No. So in the absence of, you know, I'm a realist. You know? So
I must have misheard. I heard the should, I didn't hear the will.
No, I said, should it come from rich donor countries? The answer is yes. Will it? The answer is no. And so if that is going to be the case, what do we do to look at where the money is actually coming from now and enhance that, and then use that to leverage the other resources that are available around the world? If you look at the work done by the New Climate Economy, it says we need, just on restoration, I'm coming back to maintenance, $250 billion a year to restore the degraded landscapes. We are spending 1/10 of that. But of the 1/10 we spend, 60% comes from the domestic resources of the developing countries themselves. And most people do not know that even in Africa, only 12 countries are receiving aid that is more than 40% of their budget. What does all this say? It means that countries are really financing their own development, and that's the way it should be. So if we want to maintain this, we need to now look at those countries and say, how can we assist you to raise more of your own domestic resources? What is missing in that equation in terms of tax administration, tax policy, in terms of illicit flows, all those resources that if 50 billion is leaving Africa in terms of illicit flows, the African countries need to act, yes. But the countries outside also need to act. If you kept that 50 billion, some of that money we are talking about could then go to issues like this. So that is what I mean by, now if we get the domestic resources, we can now say, how do we leverage it using the models that Ariane talked about to get more private resources into this? But, you know, we talk about these innovative financing mechanisms and so, but the key issue is risk. And the international community is not coming together yet to say, what are the de-risking mechanisms that we can put together that will enable these domestic resources to leverage the trillions that are sloshing around? So that's where the frustration of someone like myself comes. This is not an insoluble problem. But every forum you go to, we talk of this innovative financing, but nobody is doing it.
Thank you again for that, but I'll just bring you back to my question if you'll permit me.
I answered the question I wanted.
You answered it as you wanted to. Okay. Well, then I'll give you another opportunity to say that you don't know the answer.
No. You said, what is the tension between the restoration versus maintaining what we have?
We know that as far as forest carbon goes, we need to, as a matter of priority, conserve what's already there as well as improve what's been degraded.
Right.
Politicians, especially politicians with limited resources, which they worry about mobilizing in the way that you suggest, worry about people. They don't worry about standing trees. How do you get past that tension so that governments are putting sufficient focus on areas of their country which have the fewest people living among them?
No, I think it's a real problem. And immersed in that is the fact that exploitation of some of these resources benefit certain populations to the detriment of others. And I think the only way you have to do it is by mobilizing the local communities who benefit from and live off of these resources. Very often, they don't have a voice. So it is really finding a way to give them voice and to say that this matters, one. Second is to show just what the devastating impact of removing those resources are. And we have so many examples where countries have allowed this degradation to continue, be it from Indonesia to Nigeria to DRC to anywhere, you know, to all countries. You can find examples. I think we need to do more of using those examples to put in front of politicians and policymakers and say, this is what you're heading for if you don't do the right thing. But above all, I believe in the communities being involved.
You are the only one of our 4 panelists who didn't end by saying that you were optimistic, I think.
No, I did actually.
Did you?
I said I keep my fingers crossed.
That's very different. That is very different. That is very different. Then let me ask you, and this is a final quick invitation to you, how optimistic are you about the state of Africa's landscapes? Fast-growing populations, limited resources, poor governance problems, etc. We know all of the countervailing pressures.
And the other thing you've got to know about Africa, much of the developing world, is that with 50% of the population or more under 25, we're also talking of young people and their expectations. And actually, that's what makes me a little optimistic, because these young people, they know they follow better. They want more. They expect more. They want more transparency. They want the governments to do the right thing. And I think that it is a push. If we don't do it, we'll have these problems that we have now, migration, people not getting work, being moved from where they are. So I'm thinking that with the new technologies, that the grasp they have on the issues and their quest for transparency, that they will push politicians and policymakers. They're already doing that into a space that enables them to act more. But right now, I'm not comfortable because I think the conversation on these landscapes is still very limited, to be honest. I don't think it's as widespread either among governments or policymakers as we would want it to be. And so they need to push those in positions of power to do more of this thinking and talking. And inevitably, I think it will come.
Thank you very much. Peter, I was going to give you the final words anyway, but now I have to. I think you wanted to comment on that last question anyway, but after you've done so, can I just encourage you to conclude for us by saying, what is it that you want to hear, not only the rest of today, but tomorrow too, in terms of this question? How do we mobilize investment levels of money to sustaining and improving, managing better our landscapes?
Thank you. The comment I had was that we seem to look at investments in a fairly top-down manner, as if it is something that's designed somewhere centrally and then applied. The investments are obviously made by the local stakeholders themselves, and they are the ones taking the risks. And I think we need to take that perspective into the first account, and also in that context ask ourselves, how important does then climate finance become? Because that's an open question, let's say. And on your then question on what should we do, I think we should think both bigger and smaller. I think we should think smaller in the sense of what I just said, that the investments and the risks are really among smallholders. It's not about designing a mega fund somewhere that will magically transform everything that is done on the ground. We have to think smaller in the sense of looking at the real investors and the real risk takers. But we also need to think bigger, because most of the initiatives that we talk about in terms of finance and investments, they may sound big. $100 billion per year may sound big, but is it really? Many of the innovative financing that was mentioned are very well intended, but are they scalable? Are they scalable to the type of scale that we really need? That is to provide 500 million smallholders access to affordable and long-term capital in a way that supports the sustainable development that we all need. So we need to think both bigger and smaller.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And questions there too. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our panel discussion, but will you please join with me in thanking very much our distinguished panelists, Baroness de Rothschild, Dr. Ngozi, Emmanuel, Faber, and Peter Holmgren. Very good.
Can you hear me?